With me today, three guests. David Berlinski is a philosopher, mathematician, and author who has lived in Paris for a couple of decades now and is now the editor of Inference, the International Review of Science. David GERLERNTER is a professor of computer science at Yale and the author of a number of books, including most recently The Tides of Mind, Uncovering the Spectrum of Consciousness. Stephen MEYER is a philosopher and author. He directs the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute, a think tank in Seattle. Here's what brings us together. In the Claremont Review of Books this past spring, David GERLERNTER published an essay titled Giving Up Darwin. Quote, Stephen Meyer's thoughtful and meticulous book, Darwin's Doubt, convinced me that Darwin has failed. The Deniable Darwin and Other Essays, a book by David Berlinski, is also, quote, essential. David GERLERNTER, David Berlinski, Stephen MEYER, welcome.
Thank you.
All right, definitions. Darwin's book is on the origin of species, and to quote from David GERLERNTER's essay, quote, there's no reason to doubt that Darwin successfully explained the small adjustments by which an organism adapts to local circumstances, changes to fur density, or wing style, or beak shape. Yet there are many reasons to doubt whether he can explain the big picture, not the fine-tuning of existing species, but the emergence of new ones.
It was a comprehensive synthesis, and so from the standpoint of what scientists look for, it had an appeal. It was also a well-argued book, The Origin of Species, but it was well-argued on the basis of evidence that was known in the 19th century and not things that we've learned mostly from the 20th and 21st.
Okay, we come to that now. Again from David GERLERNTER's essay, quote, Darwinian, the fossil record, problem one, the fossil record, Darwinian evolution, I'm quoting you, is gradual, step by step. Yet in the Cambrian explosion of around 500 million years ago, a striking variety of new organisms, including the first ever animals, pop up suddenly in the fossil record over a mere 70 million years.
Yeah, it was a problem that even Darwin was aware of, and he wrote about it in The Origin of Species. He said it was inexplicable on his view of life. But he felt that the future fossil finds would fill in the missing ancestral forms that were evident. What happens in the Cambrian is you get a huge number of what are called the animal body plans, where a body plan is a unique configuration of body parts and tissues. And they arrive very abruptly in the fossil record without discernible connection to earlier precursors or earlier ancestors in the Precambrian record.
If this wall were the side of a canyon, halfway up we'd see...
You have a stripe of rock, and in that stripe you'd find a whole bunch of new forms of animal life.
And in the layers underneath there would be no intermediate, there'd be nothing leading to that.
With any discernible connection. Right. And so the Cambrian explosion itself has been differently dated, but increasingly the date that David used of 70 million years is a very generous date for it. The age range is actually narrowing as a result of additional findings. It's now about 10 million years is the increasingly accepted date, and there are major explosions. In one Chinese seam, there's 13 to 16 different major groups of animals that have arisen in a 5 to 6 million year window. It's incredibly abrupt geologically when you consider the age of the Earth is 4.5 billion years. It's also very abrupt biologically, because there is a mathematical branch of Darwinian theory called population genetics that allows us to calculate how much change, evolutionary change, we ought to expect in a given amount of time if we know things like the mutation rate, the generation time, the population sizes. And 5, 10, even 70 million years is a blink of an eye in terms of the calculations that can be made for what are called waiting times. And the expected waiting times for the amount of change that's evident in the Cambrian blow out the time scale, if you will. They're hundreds of millions or billions of years. So this is a really unexpected event, both biologically, mathematically, and geologically on a Darwinian view of things.
What does generating new forms of life entail? Many biologists agree that generating a new shape of protein is the essence of it. Argument step number one. Argument step number two. And inventing a new protein means inventing a new gene.
I'll explain it in terms that would be familiar to David. If you want to give a computer a new function, write a new program for it to accomplish a new function, you've got to give it new code. And the big discovery of 20th century biology following Watson and Crick in what's now called the molecular biological revolution, is the same thing is true in life. You want to invent a new form of life, you've got to have code in the form of the information inscribed along the spine of the DNA molecule, and we're learning, and other forms of information. So you need the information to build the protein molecules that service the different types of cells, and then you need additional information to arrange the cells into the body plans. And so the Cambrian explosion is an explosion of biological form, but it's also an explosion of biological information. And that fact gives us a way of grappling with this question that Darwin didn't have, because we know something about what it takes to generate information in our high-tech digital world of computing.
It was like a little brick of jello. It was an undifferentiated, quite uncomplicated thing, and you could imagine putting many, many, many of them together and getting different forms of life. Is that roughly fair?
Yeah, it was good enough for Darwin. It's probably good enough for us as well, but it's not true.
It's not
That's
true.
the big problem. The cell is an unbelievably complex bit of machinery, unfathomably complex. And we haven't understood its complexity at all. Every time we look, there seems to be an additional layer of rebarbative complexity that needs to be factored into our theories. Don't forget, the eternal goal is to explain the emergence of this complexity.
Yes.
And if we're continually behind the curve because the complexity is increasing every time we look, that eternal goal is also receding from view, not approaching, it's receding. It's becoming more and more difficult to construct a theory for that.
You know, the mathematical element of this, not of population genetics in the complex, sophisticated, predictive sense that Steve was referring to, but just the simple issue of the code. It is remarkable for young people to learn in high school. It's remarkable for me, or in elementary school, to learn that proteins, molecules are assembled because there are codes in the nucleus of cells that spell them out, character by character, codon by codon. This codon means this amino acid, and the next one means that, and the next one means that. But the mathematics underlying these codons is very simple, and Darwin could perfectly well have understood if he had the facts. Each one of these positions has to be occupied by one of 20 amino acids. Okay, so you pick one of 20 guys for this position, and one of 20 guys for this position.
You talk about visualizing a string of beads.
Yeah, like a string of beads.
As you're building a protein. Yeah.
So you have 4 different colored beads, roughly?
I'm building a protein out of amino acids.
Yes.
And I'm doing it by choosing the amino acids one by one by one by one by one.
Yes.
And I have 20 choices each time. Now, if there are several hundred of these things, that's a huge number of possible choices. The number of ways you can arrange that is huge, grows exponentially as the string gets longer.
Yes.
Berlinsky has a memorable phrase
Go ahead.
to describe this mathematical problem. He calls it the problem of combinatorial inflation.
Yes, yes,
As the required length of the protein molecule grows, the numbers grow exponentially. They inflate exponentially.
In this huge, unimaginably vast universe of possible combinations, the number of combinations that would produce a useful protein is what?
Exceedingly rare. Exceedingly rare. And this is what we didn't know until the last couple decades. There was an extraordinary conference in the 1960s held by, convened by a number of MIT scientists, some of whom David knew very well, Murray Eden, Marco Schutzenberger, and they were the first to see the mathematical problem with Darwinism. They called it, their conference was called Mathematical Challenges to Neo-Darwinism. But at the time, they could compute the number of possible arrangements, but they didn't know at the time how many of the arrangements would result in functional proteins that would do a job in the cell. And so they didn't know, they couldn't exactly measure how hard the search would be on a random basis. Especially the computer scientists, Murray Eden and others, knew that based on computer science, if this is functioning like a true linguistic system, it's unlikely that you can do a random search and find a meaningful string of characters in DNA that will produce a meaningful protein.
Okay.
But people didn't know in the 1960s. By the early 2000s, there have been a number of different experimental measures of the rarity of the functional genes and proteins versus all the gibberish sequences.
Right.
And for example, just one result, for a short protein 150 amino acids long, the ratio is one protein that will fold into a functional structure compared to 10 to the 77th gibberish sequences. So the ratio of functional to non-functional is 1 over 10 to the 77th power.
But the theory understands that mutations are rare, and successful ones even scarcer. Darwinism knows this. To balance that out, there are many organisms and a staggering immensity of time. Your chances of winning might be infinitesimal, but if you play the game often enough, you win in the end.
There's always an often enough, and the question is, does the history of life with which Darwin was concerned allow you enough chances to make it at all probable? From whatever angle you come at it, the answer is no, there has not been enough time. The number of throws we've had is too puny even to talk about. It doesn't even approach puniness, and certainly is nowhere near reasonable. So we would get that if we had a reasonable time, but we don't. We didn't. We haven't.
If you have 1 over 10 to the 77th power is your ratio, but then you have if every organism in the history of the planet, and we can estimate that, about 10 to the 40th organisms. So you divide
Bacteria, little tiny things, everything, every mosquito, every bacterium.
Yeah, every time one of those replicates, there's a possibility for a mutation that could search the space of possibilities. So you got 10 to the 40th possible mutations against a search space 10 to the 77th strong.
Right.
So if you do your exponential math, you end up with, what it means is you can search 1 10 trillion trillionth of the possible combinations. So in that case, are you more likely to succeed or fail? You're overwhelmingly more likely to fail to find one of the functional combinations, even taking into account every organism that's lived on Earth.
To help create a brand new form of organism, a mutation must affect a gene that does its job early and in the development of the life form, and controls the expression of other genes that come into play as the organism grows. Evidently, there are a total of no examples in the literature of mutations that affect early development and the body plan as a whole and are not fatal.
If I want to direct the assembly of an animal, that I've got to get in there early before they've finished putting them together, putting all the, the hoofs on and getting the wool on. If he's a sheep, I like sheep, I have to say, I have to get in there early before they start building them. So I've got to act early. Now, if I'm going to create a new species, I'm going to mutate, and instead of building a sheep, I'm going to build a little horse. There may be a mutation that makes me order purple wool, or the wrong color hooves, or a stomach that won't quite fit. But a mutation that is going to recreate the creature in such a way that it's a different creature is, biologists tell me and farmers tell me, almost certainly likely to be fatal. I mean, a mutation that makes a huge difference and that starts putting the head on backwards, because this is right early on that I'm acting when I'm doing tremendously important things. And if I make a slip at this all-important stage, I'm not going to make a little error in the density of the fur. It's going to be a big error in the design of the internal, the external, that makes this creature what it is.
A good argumentative disjunction, if you talk about major changes, if they come late in development, they're not going to make a difference. The organism is already constructed. May have
Maybe
more
the color
lavish
of the fur,
eyebrows.
right, okay.
If they come early, they can't make a difference because inevitably they destroy the organism.
Too many things downstream depend on those early cell divisions.
So we're faced with a real destructive dilemma. Late, no good. Early, no good. Well, when? We've sort of exhausted the possibilities.
Evidence suggests to MEYER, who's seated with us today, that an intelligent designer must have been responsible. I can't accept intelligent design as MEYER presents it. You also have seated next to you David Berlinski, this is David, who has said that his attitude toward intelligent design, and I'm quoting him, is warm but distant. It's the same attitude that I display toward my ex-wives. Tell us what intelligent design is that distinguishes it from some kind of effort to sneak God in by some back door.
Big discovery of the 1950s and 60s was that the DNA molecule encodes information in a roughly digital or alphabetic or typographic form.
Why do you use the term digital?
Well, because in computer science we have characters, zeros and ones.
I see.
This is Crick, 1957. It's the sequence hypothesis. He realized that the information in DNA, or the chemical subunits of DNA called nucleotide bases, were functioning like alphabetic characters in a written text, or like the zeros and ones in a section of computer code. That is to say, it wasn't their chemical properties that gave them their function, but rather their specific arrangement in accord with an independent symbol convention, which was later explicated in the form of what we call the genetic code. So we had genetic text functioning according to a code.
So it really was it was pure information.
This is a genuine information storage system. Crick, by the way, was a code breaker in World War II. So this is fascinating, is an application of the information sciences to molecular biology. Now this is the argument that I make, is that what we know from experience is that information, whether we find it in a hieroglyphic inscription or a paragraph in a book or information embedded in a radio signal or in a section of computer code, whenever we find information and we trace it back to its ultimate source, we always come to a mind, not a material process. And what I do in the book, in Darwin's Doubt, and in my prior book, Signature in the Cell, is show that these undirected evolutionary mechanisms that have been proposed as an explanation for the origin of information fail for various reasons. We've talked about the reason the Darwinian mechanism fails because it can't search the space when it's so vast. The odds are overwhelmingly against it. So if we, from a materialistic evolutionary standpoint, don't have any explanation for the origin of the information that's necessary to build new biological form. And yet we do know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, of a source of information, of a cause of the origin of information. That cause is intelligence or mind. And so what I've argued in both Darwin's Doubt and Signature in the Cell is that what we're seeing in life is evidence of the activity of a directing mind in the history of life.
If there was an intelligent designer, what was his strategy? How did he manage to back himself into so many corners, wasting energy on so many doomed organisms? What was his purpose? And why did he do such a slipshod job? Why are we so disease-prone, heartbreak-prone, and so on, close quote.
Is it good that the Earth was created? Is it good that the universe was created? Is it good that it happened? If we had to go back and do it all again, we'd have to tell the Almighty, don't do it. The suffering outweighs the good.
All right. Stephen? So if it's intelligent design, it wasn't that intelligent.
I look at it a little differently. I see two things when I look at nature. I see evidence of design, or aboriginal design.
Aboriginal meaning?
From the beginning, in different groups of organisms.
From the get-go.
But you also see evidence of decay. And that's also something that's consistent with when designers make things, then there's this thing we call entropy. And I think here a theological perspective does help, because I think from the Judeo-Christian perspective, you would expect to see both evidence of original creation or original design, but you would also expect to see that something's gone wrong in nature as well. And I think we see both.
Outside the scientific world, one might not know how ideologically bent the world of science, parts of the world of science are becoming. I say it with real sorrow, and it's certainly not true of every scientist or even of most scientists, but we have a cautionary tale in what happened to our English departments and our history departments.
Darwinism is no longer just a scientific theory, but the basis of a world view and an emergency religion for the many troubled souls who need one. Lots of people have invested lots of energy in discrediting Dr. BERLINSKI and Dr. MEYER over the years. And now GERLERNTER goes over to the other side?
He's been with us all along.
So what's the reception been
Traitor.
at New Haven and in your profession, in academia?
I have to make a distinction between the way I've been treated personally, which is in a very courteous and collegial way by my colleagues at Yale. They're nice guys, and I like them. They're my friends. On the other hand, when I look at their intellectual behavior, what they publish, and much more important, what they tell their students, Darwinism has indeed passed beyond a scientific argument as far as they are concerned. You take your life in your hands to challenge it intellectually.
Yes.
They will destroy you if you challenge it. Now, I haven't been destroyed. I'm not a biologist, and I don't claim to be an authority on this topic. But a book review is not the same as a book. It's sort of a satellite around the book. Anyway, it remains the case that I have nothing personally to charge my colleagues with. But what I've seen in their behavior intellectually and at colleges across the West is nothing approaching free speech on this topic, is a bitter rejection, not just a sort of bitter, fundamental, angry, outraged, violent rejection, which comes nowhere near scientific or intellectual discussion. I've seen that happen again and again. I'm a Darwinism. Don't you say a word against it, or I don't want to hear you, period.
Which proves that you're attacking their religion, in effect.
I am attacking their religion, and I don't blame them for being all head up. It is a big issue for them, unquestionably.
This is C.S. Lewis. Granted that reason is prior to matter, I can understand how men should come to know a lot about the universe they live in. If, on the other hand, I swallow the scientific cosmology, and for scientific cosmology, we may as well read the Darwinian theory of evolution. If I swallow the scientific cosmology, then not only can I not fit in religion, but I cannot even fit in science. Here we go. Here's the payoff on this. If minds are wholly dependent on brains, and brains on biochemistry, and biochemistry on the meaningless flux of the atoms, I cannot understand how the thought of those minds should have any more significance than the sound of the wind in the trees.
This is what bothered Thomas Nagel, and why he's become a skeptic of neo-Darwinism, is that minds are real things. And if you can't give an account of where they came from or what they do that isn't itself self-defeating, then you end up in a really incoherent philosophy.
To GERLERNTER to break the tie, because his latest book was on consciousness.
I have to agree. I am also an admirer of Nagel. And the question of consciousness is unsolved. You can argue whether it's important or not. I think most people intuitively believe it's important. I think they're right. But the question of the origins of life and the origins of consciousness are the intellectual bookends of modern science and philosophy. And we can't say much about either of them.
Darwin now poses a final challenge. Whether biology will rise to this last one as well as it did to the first when his theory upset every apple cart remains to be seen. How cleanly and quickly can the field get over Darwin and move on? Striking sentence. This is one of the most important questions facing science in the 21st century.
The students in my class are all Darwinists. So these guys know more about it than I do. I'm not hopeful.
Well, I think Darwin is eternal. Because
Eternal.
Eternal. The name is eternal, the idea is eternal, the belief, the commitment, they're all eternal. The theory will disappear, in good riddance to a bad theory. But no matter
Excuse me,
what...
it was a beautiful theory.
All right, it's a beautiful theory. Whatever it is, it will disappear. But whatever replaces it will be called Darwinian. No doubt about that. No matter what Christian heresy emerges in the tides of time, it's always called a Christian heresy. This will be a Darwinian heresy. But that legacy, that commemorative legacy, will never disappear. It's part of the history of the subject. Just like Newton will not disappear.
Darwinism has filled a niche in our intellectual life that is necessary. You've got to give some kind of account of where all these wonderfully intricate systems we call living organisms came from. And the fundamental commitment of Darwinism is to some kind of bottom-up materialistic account where the molecules get more complex and form more complex molecules in cells, and the cells compete to form more complex organisms. I think all Darwinians, in the broad sense, get it wrong. They're trying to explain something very, very complex in terms of bottom-up, undirected processes. And yet what we see in life, complex miniature machines, complex information processing systems, digital code. These are things that bear the hallmark of mind, and they suggest rather a top-down instead of a bottom-up approach. So I'm sure people committed to a materialistic view of things will continue to generate bottom-up explanations. But I think we're in a new day. We're looking at life in light of our own high-tech digital computing technologies and realizing these systems bear all the hallmarks of design. Let's start to look at life differently. Looking at life as a design system is actually yielding insights into how life works.
It's a new day? You'll go with that?
Yeah, sort of. There's been big changes, let's put it this way. I think what we have determined is that Darwin created a 19th century local theory without looking at extreme cases that was reasonably successful for breeders, for the explanation of local characteristics like beak size or the growth of wings, but he entirely failed to explain what he thought he was explaining, the emergence of biological complexity on the species level or higher order levels.